She wasn't supposed to be there. The company gala glittered with chandeliers and crystal glasses, and every head turned when the quiet woman in the midnight blue dress stepped through the doors. For years, they'd passed her in hallways without seeing her at all, just the assistant, the one who fixed their mistakes and disappeared before the applause. But that night, under the soft light by the Savannah River, something shifted. She didn't arrive to impress them. She came to remind them with silence, with grace that dignity never needed permission to shine. Have you ever misjudged someone so completely that when you finally saw who they were, it left you breathless? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. The sound of sanding filled the morning air, soft, rhythmic, like a memory breathing through sawdust. Graham Whitaker stood in the open doorway of his workshop, coffee cooling in his hand, watching sunlight stripe the floors of heart pine planks. The smell of varnish and old wood clung to the place, the way regret clings to a man quietly, persistently. He was a builder by trade, but what he restored wasn't houses. It was legacies, plantation porches, marble columns, old southern mansions waiting to be reborn. People in Savannah said his firm, Whitaker Heritage Restoration, could bring history back from the dead. They didn't know how often Graham felt like one of his own ruins, sturdy on the outside, hollow underneath. At the long table, his assistant, Claire Monroe, was reviewing project ledgers. She sat with her back straight, hands calm, voice low when she answered questions. Everyone in the crew respected her, yet no one really knew her. She was simply Miss Claire, the woman who made chaos look like order. Lydia Carr swept into the workshop in a cloud of perfume and designer silk, her heels striking the floor like punctuation marks. "Darling, the Savannah Heritage Gala is next Saturday. You haven't forgotten, have you?" Graham looked up from the plans of a restored courthouse dome. "I remember," he said. His voice was even, the tone of a man used to control. She smiled the way people smile before they throw a dart. "You should bring your staff this year. Let them see what their labor looks like when the checks are written and the champagne's poured." Ben Carter, the foreman, snorted softly, sanding the edge of a stair rail. Lydia's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Graham. "It could be good for morale," she added sweetly. Graham exhaled, setting his cup down on the table. "All right," he said, half distracted. "Claire, you should come too. Black tie. Try to be on time." The workshop stilled for half a second. It wasn't what he said, it was how. The dry humor of a man who didn't mean the words to matter. Claire paused, pen above the ledger. Then, slowly, she looked up. "Of course, Mr. Whitaker." Her tone was polite, almost neutral, but Ben saw her fingers tighten just once before she closed the binder. Lydia chuckled, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve. "Oh, how wonderful," she said. "A proper family affair." The moment passed, but it left a faint crack in the air, like wood just starting to split. After Lydia left, the workshop went back to its rhythm machines, humming, men measuring. Graham buried himself in the blueprint again, pretending not to notice the silence behind him. Claire gathered invoices, moved through the room with that quiet efficiency that made her indispensable and invisible at the same time. Ben muttered under his breath. That wasn't right. Claire heard him, but didn't turn. "It's fine," she said softly. But it wasn't fine. Not really. At lunch, the crew ate on the loading dock, the spring air heavy with the scent of magnolia and sawdust. Claire sat apart, typing emails on her phone. Graham came out briefly, coffee in hand, nodding to everyone without meeting her eyes. He thought about saying something ordinary, like I was joking, but the words felt small. So he said nothing. Silence was safer. By evening, clouds gathered over the river. Claire shut down her computer, slid her chair back with quiet precision, and turned off the desk lamp. The building emptied. Outside, rain began to fall in soft, diagonal lines across the gravel lot. She stood for a moment, watching the reflections shimmer under the single security light. inside her car. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. On the passenger seat lay an unopened envelope, her mother's latest medical bill. The numbers stared up at her, merciless and ordinary. She folded it shut, put the car in gear, and drove home through the drizzle. Her apartment was small, 900 square feet of careful neatness. A worn, upright piano stood against the wall, its surface draped with framed photographs. One of them showed a younger woman in a choir robe, smiling at someone outside the frame. Claire turned it face down before hanging her coat. In the next room, her mother's voice called, faint but cheerful. "You're home early, sweetheart." Claire smiled. "You caught me." June Monroe sat in her chair, a knitted blanket over her knees, a stroke having left her right hand slower, but her spirit intact. The TV glowed with a rerun of Jeopardy! "Big day," her mother asked. Claire hesitated, pouring tea into 2 mugs. "The usual," she said. "We're finishing the courthouse stairs." June chuckled. "Your boss still running the place like a sergeant, like clockwork," Claire replied, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. After dinner, she opened her laptop, checking messages. There was one from Ben. "Ignore what happened today. He just doesn't think before he speaks." She stared at it for a while, then deleted it. Some things didn't need answering. Later that night, she sat at the piano. For a long moment, she simply touched the keys without pressing them, as if testing the air. Then she played a soft melody, halting at first, then flowing like rain against glass. The notes filled the small room, gentle and sorrowful, spilling through the cracks of her carefully held composure. Outside, thunder rolled over the river. Inside, she closed her eyes and let the music speak for her. The ache, the grace, the faint hope that maybe, somewhere, someone might finally hear. When the last note faded, she whispered, almost to herself, "Black tie, right?" A small smile, half bitter, half brave, crossed her face. Then she blew out the candle on the piano, and the room went dark except for the soft heartbeat of the city beyond the rain. The morning light in Savannah was soft and golden, the kind that made even cracked sidewalks look kind. Inside her small apartment, Claire moved through her routines with the quiet precision of someone who no longer had time for dreams. The kitchen smelled faintly of toast and coffee. On the counter sat a pill organizer, each tiny square labeled in her neat handwriting: Monday A, M, Monday P, M. Tuesday 7 little boxes, keeping her mother's heartbeat steady. 2 white, 1 blue, she murmured, shaking the tablets into her palm. She poured a glass of water and carried it to the living room, where June Monroe waited in her chair, sunlight pooling at her feet. "Morning, Mama," Claire said softly. "Time for your medicine." June smiled, lines deepening at the corners of her mouth. "You'd make a fine nurse. You know, I already am," Claire teased gently. "Just unpaid." They shared a quiet laugh. Outside, a trolley bell rang faintly from the riverfront, 2 miles away. It was a sound Claire had grown to love, steady, predictable, always passing through but never staying too long. After her mother finished breakfast, Claire turned to the small kitchen table where a bright blue lunchbox sat open. She measured out peanut butter with a 1/4-cup scoop, spreading it carefully on 2 slices of white bread. Her nephew Ethan's sneakers squeaked as he bounded in, his school backpack bouncing against his shoulder. "Cut the crusts off." "Aunt Claire, you're getting too old for that." "Please," he grinned, knowing she'd give in. She sighed, slicing the sandwich cleanly. "All right, but one day, you're eating them. Deal." Ethan hugged her quickly before darting out the door. She watched him run down the walkway, the morning sun glinting on his backpack zipper, and for a moment her chest filled with something that was both love and fear, the kind that came from raising someone else's child and praying not to fail. When the door closed, she leaned against the counter, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock above the sink. Her world was measured in small sounds like that heartbeats of a life no one noticed. On the piano, the photograph she'd turned face down the night before caught a stray beam of sunlight. The girl in the picture, her younger self, in a white choir robe, eyes bright. Voice lifted in a hymn, long forgotten, seemed to be staring at her through the glass. Claire hesitated, then placed the frame back down. Some doors were better left half closed. By 8:30, she was out the door, carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag with folders thick enough to break the strap. The drive to the workshop was short. Spanish moss swayed above the road, filtering the light like lace. On days like this, Savannah felt suspended between centuries, graceful and tired at once. At the office, the air smelled of turpentine and sawdust. The crew was already at work, the rhythmic whine of a planer slicing through pine. Graham's truck was parked out front. He always arrived before dawn. Claire unlocked her desk, powered on the computer, and began sorting the day's chaos into order. Invoices stacked in her inbox like dominoes waiting to fall. One from a lumber supplier in Macon, wrong unit cost. Another from the marble yard, short by 20 square feet. Claire adjusted both without a word, saving the firm hundreds in less than a minute. She sent 3 emails, scheduled a city inspection, rescheduled a vendor delivery, delayed by rain, and made a note about a variance in the courthouse banister dimensions. A 1/16 of an inch too wide on the left side, she'd spotted it while filing photos from last week. She scribbled it down for Ben. No one would ever thank her for that. But that wasn't why she did it. She stopped briefly at the break room, poured herself more coffee. From inside the workshop came the muffled voices of Graham and a client. He sounded tired. It was the same tone she'd heard the day before, the tone of a man who thought competence replaced kindness. She took a slow sip, staring at the rain-specked window. Maybe he didn't mean to hurt her. Maybe he never thought she could be hurt. That was the thing about people who were used to being seen. They didn't notice those who lived quietly in the edges of their light. Near noon. Her phone buzzed. It was the clinic routine reminder for her mother's rehab appointment. Claire thanked them, opened her planner, and penciled it between project calls. Her life was a grid of obligations, each box filled with other people's needs. She didn't resent it, but sometimes, in rare unguarded moments, she wondered if anyone would ever fill a box for her. At 3, the sky opened. Rain struck the tin roof like applause. She loved that sound, the music of storms, alive and uncontrollable. She turned down her desk lamp and listened for a moment, eyes half closed, letting the noise wash away the morning. When she opened them again, Graham was standing near the door, tie loosened, holding 2 blueprints. "Claire, the county wants revised specs by Monday," he said. "Can you handle it?" "Of course," she replied, already reaching for the files. He hesitated as if to add something else, maybe an apology, maybe nothing at all. But then he only said, "Good," and left. She watched him walk away, shoulders tight, back straight. People carried their pride like armor. She carried silence like grace. By the time she left the office, dusk had begun to settle over the river. The city glowed in amber and violet. She drove home slowly, headlights slicing through the drizzle. At a red light, she thought of the gala, how Lydia's laugh had sounded, how the room might look with its gold chandeliers and white tablecloths. She imagined herself standing there, not as an ornament, but as someone who belonged. The thought felt dangerous, almost tender. When she arrived home, the apartment was warm and full of life. Ethan sat at the table drawing, her mother humming softly along with the television. Claire changed into an old sweatshirt, reheated leftover soup, and joined them. The simplicity of it steadied her. After dinner, June looked up from her knitting. "Honey, are you going to that fancy gala your boss mentioned?" Claire froze halfway through washing a dish. "You heard about that? I might have," June said, smiling. "He'd be a fool not to show you off." Claire shook her head. "It's not like that." Her mother tilted her head. "Then what's it like?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it seemed. Claire set the dish down carefully. "It's work, but maybe I'll go." June's eyes softened. "You should. You've spent half your life making other people's dreams stand up straight. Maybe it's time you stand for yourself." Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe," she said. That night, after everyone was asleep. She stood by the piano again. The photograph was still face down, the candle unlit. But she reached out and turned the picture upright. The girl in the frame smiled back. Unchanged, unashamed. Claire whispered to her reflection in the glass. If I go, I'll stand straight. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the air fresh, the city breathing quietly beneath a silver moon. She rested her hand on the piano lid, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small, only waiting for something she couldn't yet name. The scent of lemon oil and pine dust hung thick in the morning air, sunlight spilling through tall workshop windows. Every beam caught the swirl of sawdust like golden snow. Claire stood beside a marble hearth mantel, a perfect federal-style reproduction, her fingertips tracing the carved acanthus leaves as though reading a language only she could understand. A client couple, Mr. and Mrs. Keating, leaned close, admiring the detail. It looks just like the one in our Georgetown townhouse. Mrs. Keating said, "It's modeled after an 1815 design by Samuel McIntyre," Claire replied. Her tone was calm, unhurried. The original sketches are in the Peabody Essex Museum. You can tell by the slender fluting along the pilasters, it's almost musical. He built harmony into geometry. The clients nodded, impressed. Claire's voice had a rhythm that made old craftsmanship sound like poetry. Behind them, Graham watched from a distance, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a clipboard he'd stopped pretending to read. He'd heard her discuss details before, but never like this, never with the quiet conviction of someone who didn't just memorize the history, but felt it. She was explaining a lineage of wood and time, and he realized she knew more about half the pieces in his shop than he did. When the clients left, Mrs. Keating shook Claire's hand. "You should have your name on this," she said kindly. "People ought to know who did the real work." Claire smiled, polite but distant. "I'm part of a good team." "Ma'am, that's enough." But the compliment lingered in the air even after the couple's car pulled away. Graham set the clipboard down on a workbench, his brow furrowing. "I didn't realize you'd done that much research," he said. Claire didn't look up from the invoices she was organizing. "You never asked." There was no edge in her tone, just a simple truth. He felt it anyway. He cleared his throat. "Good job with the Keatings." "Thank you," she said, her voice even, her focus still on her papers. He wanted to say more, something genuine, but the words tangled behind his pride. Instead, he picked up a chisel and walked away, pretending to inspect a column base that didn't need inspecting. That afternoon, the shop hummed with the rhythm of industry. The foreman, Ben, and 2 apprentices shaped new banisters, counting inches under their breath. The faint notes of country radio drifted from a small speaker in the corner. Claire sat at her desk near the front window, checking material costs. Every figure had to be. Exact precision was her safety net. She worked the way some people prayed consistently, quietly, without expectation of reward. The door opened, and a burst of perfume rolled in before the voice. Lydia Carr stepped over the threshold like she owned the light. "Graham." "Darling," she called, her vowels long and honeyed. "You left my garment bags in the car. I thought I'd bring them by before they wrinkle." Graham appeared from the back, wiping his hands. "Lydia, we're working—" "Oh, I know." She smiled, setting the bags dramatically on a sawhorse. "But we can't have you looking drab at the gala. I brought options." She turned, her eyes finding Claire. "You're coming too, aren't you?" Claire stood, smoothing her skirt. "Yes, I'll be there." Lydia's smile sharpened. "Lovely. I might have something that fits you, if you'd like to borrow it. I keep a few versatile pieces." "Thank you," Claire said, polite as porcelain. "But I already have something to wear." Really, Lydia's tone carried mock surprise. "Well, wonderful. We'll all shine, won't we?" She laughed lightly, then leaned closer to Graham. "You have the most loyal people," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That kind of devotion is rare, almost quaint." Graham didn't answer. He looked at Claire, but she was already turning back to her desk, calm and unmoved. When Lydia finally left, Ben muttered, "You want me to build a pedestal for her ego?" Next, Claire shook her head, almost smiling. "Leave her be, Ben. Some people measure worth in fabric and invitations, others in finish and patience." Ben grinned. "Well, you've got the second part down." The shop laughed, easing the tension. But when Claire returned to her desk, her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with the hospital's billing department. She hesitated before opening the message. "Balance passed. Du 147,62." Her thumb hovered over the reply button, but she locked the screen instead. For a long moment, she stared at her reflection in the black glass, steady eyes. Tired mouth. Graham's voice called from the back. "Claire, can you double-check the flooring specs?" "Yes," she answered, her tone steady. Only her breath betrayed the small tremor inside. The day wound down slowly. Rain clouds gathered outside, dimming the light. Claire packed her files into her tote, lined up the pencils on her desk as she always did. When she turned off the lamp, the room looked suddenly larger and lonelier. That night, at home, she made tea while Ethan colored at the table. Her mother dozed in the armchair, the rhythmic wheeze of the oxygen machine filling the silence. Claire moved quietly, as if afraid to wake something fragile in the air. After Ethan went to bed, she opened her closet. Inside, among a row of neatly pressed blouses and cardigans, sat a long, flat box worn at the corners, tied with fading ribbon. She pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed. Inside lay a dress midnight blue satin, simple but elegant. Her sister Emily had worn it once to sing at a charity concert the year before the accident. Claire ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling both the smoothness and the ache it carried. The phone buzzed again, a reminder from the hospital app. Insistent. She silenced it without looking. Then, slowly, she lifted the dress from the box, letting the folds spill across her lap. It still shimmered in the dim light, like a night sky caught in silk. She whispered to the empty room, "You always did have better taste." Her throat tightened, but she smiled through it. The dress wasn't new, but it was honest. She didn't need to borrow anyone's shine. She folded the tissue paper back over the box and set it on the chair. Tomorrow she'd take it to be pressed. In the living room, the rain began again, tapping gently against the windows. Claire stood there for a long while, listening to the sound steady, patient, relentless. The kind of rhythm that wore down stone, not by force, but by persistence. When she finally turned out the light, her reflection in the darkened window looked different, not transformed, just certain. Whatever that gala would bring, she would walk in with her head high, her dress her sister's, her dignity her own. The chandeliers glowed like captured moons, their light spilling across linen and silver and the soft blur of laughter. Outside the grand ballroom windows, the Savannah River glimmered under the dusk, moving slow and patient, as if the tide itself had dressed for the occasion. The Savannah Heritage Gala was the kind of event where history and vanity shook hands, where old money didn't just talk. It hummed in the air like perfume. Waiters in white jackets moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of oysters on crushed ice, champagne flutes balanced like glass wands. Graham Whitaker stood near the bar, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a drink he'd forgotten to sip. His bow tie was slightly crooked, a rare imperfection that made him look more human than usual. Around him, voices blended into a tapestry of practiced charm. Graham. A voice behind him, smooth, deliberate. Lydia Carr arrived in a haze of rose-colored silk, her gown glittering under the light. "You look almost relaxed," she teased, looping her arm through his. "Shall we make our rounds?" He managed a small smile. "Lead the way." She steered him toward a circle of donors near the raw bar line. "You've met the Monroes," she cooed. "Not those Monroes. Of course the Charleston branch." The men chuckled politely. Women offered half compliments that sounded like praise dipped in sugar. Someone whispered near the martini table, not softly enough. He invited his assistant. Then came a low laugh, 2 syllables that landed like a pin on glass. Lydia's smile froze for half a heartbeat before returning to full wattage. "People will talk about anything," she murmured to Graham, her tone light but edged. "Best not to feed them." He nodded, though something inside him tightened. He scanned the room instinctively, half expecting to see Claire's calm figure somewhere near the entrance. But she wasn't there. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The band began to play a slow waltz that drifted across the room like perfume. Couples moved to the dance floor, their laughter floating above the music. Graham stood apart, his gaze drawn toward the tall doors leading to the foyer. "She's not coming," Lydia said softly, watching him watch the door. "She said she would," he replied, perhaps too quickly. Lydia arched a brow. "It's probably for the best. These events can be intimidating for people who don't breathe this air every day." He turned toward her, his voice measured. "You mean for people who weren't born into it?" Her smile didn't falter. "I mean for people who haven't learned how to pretend they enjoy it." He wanted to argue, but the truth in her words was too sharp. The truth was he didn't enjoy it either. He felt like a man standing in a house built on the bones of someone else's labor. Every crystal, every column, a reminder of unearned inheritance. The mayor came over to shake his hand, then a board member, then 2 patrons from Charleston. Lydia handled them all with the poise of a politician's daughter, laughter bright and hollow. Graham nodded when needed, smiled when expected. His glass stayed full. He thought of the workshop, the smell of sawdust, the sound of Ben's laughter, the soft hum of Claire's typing by the window. The memory of it felt strangely grounding amid all this polished noise. At the far end of the ballroom, a group of young architects chatted about restoration projects. One of them, a man barely 30, mentioned Whitaker's firm with a grin. "You've built quite a reputation, Mr. Whitaker. You must have an army of designers to keep all those projects on track." Graham smiled faintly. "Just 1 or 2 good people," he said. "That's usually enough. Your assistant Claire. Right, she's quite sharp. I heard she caught an error in the courthouse design before it went to bid. Saved the city a fortune." He blinked. "You heard that?" The man shrugged. "Word gets around." "She's the reason your firm has the best quality control in the region." For a moment, Graham didn't answer. The orchestra swelled, and he felt something like pride, tinged with shame, pride that she was recognized, shame that he'd never said it aloud himself. Lydia touched his arm, breaking the thought. "Come on, the auction's starting." He followed her toward the stage, though his eyes flickered once more toward the entrance. Still empty. The ache surprised him, an uninvited emotion pressing against the wall of composure he'd spent years building. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the ballroom. "Lot 17, a private tour of the newly restored Whitaker mansion, led by the man himself, Mr. Graham Whitaker." Polite applause. Graham raised his glass in acknowledgement, smiled the practiced smile of civic gratitude. The lights caught the fine lines around his eyes, making him look older than he'd felt that morning. When the bidding began, Lydia whispered, "See you're the showpiece tonight." He leaned closer. "Funny. I don't feel like one." "Then pretend," she said, her voice honey over steel. Outside, through the tall windows, the river shimmered in the dark. Tugboats passed like ghosts, their horns echoing across the water. For a moment, he envied them their purpose simple, their path clear. Half an hour later, he slipped away to the edge of the terrace for air. The night smelled of salt and magnolia. From here, the ballroom's laughter sounded distant, like something happening to someone else. He checked his watch. Nearly 9. She was late. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe she'd realized this world wasn't meant for her. Or maybe, he thought uneasily, she'd simply decided she didn't need his permission to belong. Behind him, Lydia's voice drifted through the open doors. "Graham, darling, the donors are waiting." He didn't move right away. He watched the river, the current pulling soft and strong beneath the lights. Somewhere beyond the bend, The night deepened to indigo, the same color, he realized suddenly, as the dress folded in Claire's box. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, and yet it stayed. When he finally turned back toward the ballroom, the laughter seemed louder, the chandeliers brighter, the air thinner. He buttoned his jacket, exhaled slowly, and walked inside. As he reached the center of the room, the grand doors behind him opened with a soft, deliberate sound. He stopped mid-step. Conversations faltered. Even Lydia glanced toward the entryway. But when he turned, the doorway stood empty. Only a waiter entered, carrying a tray of champagne. The moment passed, dissolving into laughter. He smiled faintly, hiding his disappointment behind habit. Yet something inside him, a quiet, stubborn pulse, refused to settle. He didn't know what it meant, only that the night suddenly felt incomplete without her. The ballroom lights shimmered against the river's slow current, 1,000 reflections bending and trembling across the glass. Inside, the laughter had grown louder, the kind of sound that came not from joy, but from habit. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, violins floating beneath the crystal chandeliers. Graham stood near the bar again, trying and failing to lose himself in the crowd. He checked his watch once more, almost 9:30. The champagne in his glass had gone flat. He set it down, ready to admit she wasn't coming. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed the soft stir near the entrance. Not the kind of commotion that announces royalty, something smaller, quieter, yet far more powerful. The doors opened without flourish, and for a moment, all that entered was the river light itself, silver and soft, spilling over the marble floor. Then she stepped through, Claire Monroe. She didn't glide or pose. She simply walked unhurried, steady, shoulders back. Her dress, the shade of deep midnight, caught the chandelier glow like still water under moonlight. No sequins, no shimmer, only the quiet luster of fine fabric that moved as she did, graceful, unbothered. Her hair was swept back, revealing the soft lines of her neck. Around it hung a small silver locket, its surface worn smooth, the kind of keepsake that held more memory than metal. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to forget its rhythm. Conversation faltered. Even the orchestra wavered for half a measure, as if the air itself had shifted. It wasn't a Cinderella moment, no gasps, no glass slipper fantasy. It was subtler, deeper, the rare stillness that falls when people sense something genuine and don't yet know what to call it. Lydia saw her first. Her laugh froze in midair. "Well," she murmured, smile tightening like a silk ribbon drawn too taut. She did come. When Claire reached the edge of the ballroom, a waiter hesitated, unsure whether to offer her a drink or step aside. She nodded politely, took a flute of champagne, and moved through the crowd with quiet poise. "Claire," Lydia's voice cut through the hum. "You clean up nicely." Claire turned, her expression composed, her voice warm but unyielding. "I do my best every day, Ms. Carr." The surrounding guests caught the undercurrent, immediately respect disguised as a retort. A few exchanged glances. Lydia's smile stayed bright, but her eyes cooled a shade. Graham, still half across the room, couldn't look away. He'd seen her hundreds of times before under fluorescent lights, surrounded by ledgers and tools, but never like this. There was nothing new about her face, and yet somehow it was transformed. Not beautified, exactly, but seen. She didn't need to belong to this world. She simply refused to shrink from it. He crossed the floor, but before he could reach her, a voice rose from near the stage. "Forgive me," an older man said, standing from his table, his posture elegant despite his age. "I know this is forward, but were you the soloist at St. Bart's Church after the hurricane service?" The question rippled through the nearby crowd. Claire blinked, caught off guard. "That was years ago," she said softly. The man, white-haired, distinguished, eyes alive with memory, stepped closer, emotion trembling in his tone. "I knew it. You held that Kyrie like a prayer. I conducted that service. The city was in ruins, But when you sang, people wept. You helped them believe the storm would pass. A silence spread outward, like the echo of that forgotten hymn. Claire's breath caught, a flash of the past lighting her eyes. "You're Mr. Avery," she said, recognition dawning. "You conducted the memorial for the flood victims." He nodded, smiling gently. "And you were the young woman with the voice that silenced the rain." I thought about that moment often. It was extraordinary, someone nearby whispered. "She's that Claire." Lydia's expression faltered. Graham felt something shift inside him, a slow rearranging of what he thought he knew. Claire inclined her head, humility in every gesture. It was a long time ago. "I just did what I could." Avery chuckled. "That's what grace always sounds like, someone saying they just did what they could." The orchestra, perhaps sensing the moment, softened to a quieter melody. People turned discreetly to look, not with mockery, but with genuine curiosity. The woman they'd dismissed in a whisper was suddenly a story they didn't know how to tell. Lydia leaned toward Graham, her voice low. "Well, that's unexpected." He didn't answer. He was still watching Claire the way she stood calm amid the swirl of speculation, one hand lightly on her glass, her eyes steady, but not defiant. It wasn't beauty that made the room pause. It was the weight of authenticity. She wasn't shining because of what she wore. She was shining because she no longer cared who noticed. "Mr. Avery smiled again. "You should sing again sometime. Miss Monroe. Savannah could use a little faith these days." "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her smile small and real. When he turned away, she exhaled quietly, as though releasing the ghost of that long-ago song. Graham finally approached. "I see you found the place," he said gently. "I almost didn't come," she admitted. "I'm glad you did." Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that pause, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, apology, maybe a trace of wonder. Lydia's laughter echoed from somewhere behind them, brittle and bright. The music picked up again. Chatter resumed, but the air hadn't reset entirely. The fault line between appearance and truth had cracked, and through it, something honest had begun to breathe. Claire looked toward the tall windows, where the river shimmered in reflected gold. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Graham followed her gaze. "It always is," he said. "But tonight it feels different." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the light." He nodded. "Or maybe it's what it's finally shining on." The orchestra swelled, and a waiter passed between them, breaking the moment. Graham stepped aside as another guest approached her, eager to speak. From a distance, he watched her laugh softly, respond with grace, her presence neither boastful nor timid, just real. And he realized that the woman standing before him was not someone transformed, but revealed. Outside, the river moved on, slow and certain, carrying reflections of the ballroom lights like small constellations drifting downstream. And inside, for the first time that night, Graham felt the current shift not in the water, but in himself. He didn't yet know what it meant, only that everything, somehow, had begun to change. The dinner bell chimed softly, and the ballroom began to rearrange itself into order. Waiters folded back chair covers. The orchestra faded into polite background strings, and hundreds of place cards gleamed under candlelight, tiny, embossed emblems of hierarchy. The donors moved first, drifting toward the center tables near the stage, where the napkins were folded into swans and the silverware glowed like armor. Further back, the guests of guests and staffers found their names near the floral arrangements with shorter stems and fewer candles. Claire followed the usher's gentle gesture toward the far side of the room. Her card waited at table 21, next to a vendor representative and two subcontractors she knew by voice, not by face. The seating chart, she realized, had been curated carefully, not cruelly, just predictably. Ben Carter, the foreman, spotted her from across the room. His place card was much closer to the stage, next to the architects and city officials. He caught her eye, then the layout, and gave a small, knowing shake of his head. A moment later, He was on the move, his calloused hands casually switching a few cards as he went. When Claire looked up again, he was pulling out the chair beside her. "You'll get us both in trouble," she whispered, half smiling. Ben grinned. "If trouble's the price for decent company, I'll risk it." The other guests arrived with the clatter of chair legs and light laughter. Conversation lifted like steam from a hot meal, pleasant, practiced, never truly warm. Claire listened, nodded when appropriate, her posture calm and unbothered. Graham was seated several tables away, near the mayor and the board of trustees. From his vantage point, he could see her an island of poise amid chatter. Their eyes met once across the candlelight, a brief acknowledgement that neither spoke aloud. Dinner began with shrimp and grits served in china bowls, the scent of butter and pepper filling the air. The man to Claire's right, a real estate developer with a crimson pocket square, leaned toward her with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "So, you're Whitaker's assistant," he said, his tone friendly but tipped with condescension. "Quite a leap, attending this crowd, rising from assistant to aristocrat. Are we?" A ripple of amusement passed around the table. Not cruel, just the kind of laughter that hides unease. Claire lifted her water glass, her smile as calm as the surface of the river outside. "I rise the same way every morning, sir, one floorboard at a time." For a second, there was silence. Then came a soft chuckle. Ben's first, then another from across the table. And soon the laughter turned genuine. The developer blinked, realizing too late that he'd been disarmed without a wound. "Well said," murmured one of the subcontractors. "Best toast I've heard all evening." Claire inclined her head, taking a quiet sip. Ben leaned over and whispered, "Remind me never to play cards with you." The meal went on. The hum of conversation deepened as wine glasses emptied. Graham's laughter floated faintly from his table, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. He caught glimpses of Claire, her gestures small but deliberate, the way she listened more than she spoke. He noticed how others began to listen, too. Lydia, meanwhile, had found her spotlight. At the main table, she leaned close to a visiting journalist, telling stories polished smooth by repetition. "Oh, Graham's firm is practically a family business," she said, her bracelets catching the light. "He's far too modest about his contributions to the city." When the journalist asked about Claire, Lydia's expression remained flawless. "She's competent," she said with a laugh that wasn't unkind, "and very lucky to have been given this opportunity." The journalist smiled politely, jotting nothing down. It wasn't the kind of comment that made it to print, but the kind that lingered in the air like faint smoke. Back at table 21, dessert was being served, a pecan tart with whipped cream. Claire ate slowly, savoring each bite, not for the taste, but for the steadiness it gave her. The laughter around her softened into real conversation. Ben was recounting an old job story involving a hurricane, a lost toolbox, and a goat that refused to move. Even Claire laughed, a sound low and musical. Then, as she reached for her glass, her gaze caught on the silent auction table across the room. Among the framed certificates and weekend getaways sat a single item that made her breath catch: a portable therapy keyboard, glossy and new, tagged, donated by the Savannah Arts Council to support the community choir initiative. Her hand stilled midair. The silver locket at her throat seemed to grow heavier. She could almost hear the echo of that old church rain against the windows, her sister's voice blending with hers, the hum of the piano that had once stood in their living room before the flood took it. "You all right?" Ben asked quietly. She blinked, the moment collapsing back into the present. "Yes." Just thinking how music always finds its way home. He studied her for a second longer, recognizing something in her tone he didn't name. Across the room, Graham was speaking with donors, but his attention kept drifting. When he followed her line of sight and saw the keyboard, he understood only that her expression had changed softer, distant, tinged with something like sorrow. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to cross the room and ask her what memory had just touched her. But the mayor was already addressing him, and he had to smile again. The auctioneer's voice began to echo through the hall, announcing items with theatrical energy. Applause rose and fell. People bid generously, their laughter rich and rehearsed. Claire listened but barely heard. Her world had narrowed to that one instrument gleaming under the lights. When the bidding reached the choir keyboard, she clasped her hands together to keep them still. The numbers climbed 200, 3, 4. The crowd applauded when a philanthropist at the front table made the winning bid. Claire smiled politely with everyone else. But inside, the moment ached. That sound, the touch of keys. The release of something long buried seemed suddenly within reach and just as quickly gone. Ben nudged her arm gently. "You should have bid." She laughed softly. "I can't afford nostalgia." But her eyes said otherwise. Dinner ended with coffee and obligatory speeches. People rose, moving toward the dance floor or the veranda, conversations stretching like shadows. Claire excused herself, walking toward the tall windows for air. From here, she could see the river, dark and gleaming, the city lights reflected in its slow pulse. In the glass, her own reflection hovered faintly, dress midnight blue, locket catching the chandelier glow. For the first time that night, she let herself exhale fully. The noise of the room dimmed behind her, replaced by the hush of the water beyond the glass. And as she stood there, her gaze returned once more to the small auction table, now being cleared away. The keyboard was gone. Yet, in its absence, something inside her stirred a quiet note. The beginning of a melody she hadn't let herself play in years. The ballroom was beginning to slow into the soft chaos that follows dessert music, gentler, laughter louder, the night easing into comfort. Waiters cleared plates, couples drifted toward the veranda for air. The chandeliers shimmered like still water above it all, their reflections caught in 100 glasses of champagne. Graham sat near the head table, pretending to listen to the board chairman's speech. Words blurred: legacy, community, gratitude, phrases that filled the air but meant little. Across the room, Claire was still near the window, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, her posture relaxed yet alert, as if she knew the evening wasn't quite finished with her. Lydia Carr rose when the applause faded. Her gown caught the light perfectly. Her smile was bright enough to command the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth as the champagne in her glass. "Before we close this beautiful evening, I'd like to offer one final toast." A few claps, a few expectant glances. She turned toward Graham, to the man whose steady hands have rebuilt more of Savannah than anyone since General Oglethorpe himself. Laughter scattered politely. "Graham Whitaker, our restorer of all things old and crumbling." The laughter grew, affectionate but safe. Graham stood slightly, nodding modestly. Lydia placed a hand on his arm. And truly, what would Whitaker Restoration be without the team behind it? She scanned the room, her eyes landing precisely where she meant them to. "Even his assistant is here tonight," she said lightly. "We are nothing if not inclusive." The sentence hung there elegant, brittle, and sharp as glass. Polite laughter fluttered around the room, the kind that slips out when people aren't sure if they're supposed to find something funny. Someone raised a phone. Another whispered. Camera flashes caught fragments, the smile on Lydia's lips. Graham's stiff shoulders, Claire's stillness. Claire's throat tightened. The sound of the room receded to a dull hum. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, steady but heavy, each thud echoing through the thin shell of composure she'd worn all night. She didn't move, didn't look down, didn't flinch. Only the slight tremor in her hand betrayed that the champagne flute had suddenly grown heavier. Across the table, Ben's jaw tightened. He muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a warning. Lydia's smile remained radiant. "So, here's to Graham," she continued, "and to the good people who make his vision possible, no matter where they started." The ache in Claire's chest rose like heat. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. And for a fleeting second, she imagined setting it down and simply walking out. But pride is quieter than anger. It doesn't storm. It stays, shoulders back, eyes forward. She lifted her glass, meeting Lydia's gaze across the room. "To good work," she said softly. It wasn't loud, but it carried, and the people who do it, There was something in her tone, a clarity that drew eyes to her, a calm refusal to be small. Lydia's smile faltered, but before she could recover, another voice cut through the crowd. "Excuse me?" It came from the second row of tables. Gravelly but sure. Mr. Avery, the retired conductor, was standing, his champagne untouched, his white hair catching the chandelier, light like frost. "With respect," he said, projecting with the ease of someone who'd once commanded orchestras. "Some of us are here tonight because a certain voice got us through a dark year." The room hushed instantly. All eyes turned toward him. He looked at Claire. "You may not all know it, but this young woman sang at St. Bart's after the hurricane. The city had no power, no roof in half its buildings, and yet she stood there with a borrowed keyboard and sang the Kyrie as though the world itself might listen." Claire's breath caught. Mr. Avery's voice softened but didn't waver. "If there's any music in this house tonight, it's because she kept it alive when the rest of us could barely stand." The air shifted so quietly, so completely. It was as if someone had changed the key of the entire evening. Lydia's lips parted, but no words came. A waiter froze mid-step, holding a tray suspended between tables. Cameras lowered. The laughter evaporated, replaced by something far more fragile: awareness. Claire's pulse hammered in her temples. The ballroom felt both too small and too vast. She wanted to disappear, yet some part of her knew this moment wasn't meant to be hidden. Graham stood slowly. His face was unreadable shock, pride, guilt all tangled together. He hadn't known, not about St. Bart's, not about the voice that had carried a city when its lights were gone. "I think," Mr. Avery said finally, raising his glass toward her, "that Savannah owes Miss Monroe a toast of her own." He lifted his glass high, to grace under pressure, to work done with soul. The first few claps came from the vendor's table, Ben's broad palms hitting together once, twice. Then others followed. Not the perfunctory applause of obligation, but the kind that begins when people remember their own decency. Claire didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, she raised her glass in return, her smile faint but steady. "To everyone who's ever built something that lasts," she said. The applause grew. The orchestra, unsure whether to play or wait, settled into a soft swell of strings. Lydia's face had gone pale, her perfect composure cracking at the edges. She looked toward Graham, expecting rescue, but he was still staring at Claire, at the woman he'd underestimated, now illuminated not by chandeliers, but by something far less fragile. Mr. Avery sat down again, satisfied, his expression gentle. "That's better," he murmured to no one in particular. The applause lingered, then faded into quiet conversation. The night resumed, but nothing felt the same. Claire set her glass down carefully, her hands steady now. She turned toward Ben. "You didn't have to clap so loudly," she teased softly. He grinned. Somebody had to start. Across the room. Graham still hadn't moved. He watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Part admiration, part regret, part something unnamed. Lydia leaned close to him, her voice low but sharp. "You're going to let that stand?" He didn't answer. For the first time in years, he realized he didn't have to. The orchestra began a new song, slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Conversations picked up again, but they were gentler now, the edge gone from the laughter. Claire glanced toward the river through the tall windows. The tide was coming in, carrying the reflection of the ballroom's lights like small fires moving downstream. Her chest loosened. The ache didn't vanish, but it softened. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering a silent thank you to the man who'd spoken, to the music that still lived somewhere in her, and to the quiet kind of courage that doesn't need a microphone to be heard. The ballroom had softened into its late-hour glow, where laughter thinned and the scent of champagne dulled to something almost wistful. On the balcony, the night air felt cleaner, cool river wind brushing against silk and starch. The hum of the orchestra floated through the open doors, distant and forgiving. Claire leaned against the stone balustrade, her dress dark as the river below. The city shimmered beyond her, its lights tremoring in the slow current. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze lift a strand of hair against her cheek. For the first time that night, she could breathe. Behind her, footsteps approached, measured, careful. She didn't turn. "Claire?" Graham said quietly. She opened her eyes, her reflection caught faintly in the glass doors. "Mr. Whitaker." He hesitated at the formality, then joined her at the railing. The silence between them stretched, full of everything unspoken. "I came out here to say—" He paused, as if the words themselves might sting. "That toast, what Lydia said, it wasn't fair. I should have stopped it." She didn't answer right away. The river moved below them, unhurried, as though time belonged to it and not to people who arrived too late with apologies. "Why didn't you?" she asked softly. He looked down at his hands. "I don't know. Habit? Maybe. Keeping the peace. I've spent half my life smoothing over cracks instead of fixing what caused them." Claire nodded once, not bitterly, just acknowledging the truth of it. Peace is easier when the noise isn't aimed at you. He turned toward her. "You didn't deserve that." She smiled faintly, her tone calm. "Mr. Whitaker. I stopped measuring what I deserve a long time ago. It's quieter that way." Something in the steadiness of her voice unsettled him more than anger would have. "I should have seen how it made you feel," he said. "No," she replied. "You should have seen me." Her gaze stayed on the river, but her words landed with the clarity of glass breaking. He felt them lodge somewhere deep, an echo of all the moments he'd walked past her desk, her ideas, her work, assuming competence without ever recognizing grace. She exhaled slowly. "Do you know what I did last month, the morning of the Madison Square inspection?" He frowned, searching memory. "You sent me the new permit schedule. I rescheduled the city inspector at 5:30 a.m., she said evenly. His wife had gone into labor. If he'd canceled, the project would have been delayed a week and the city would have fined us for non-compliance. No one noticed the change. The inspection passed. You got the call from the mayor that afternoon?" Graham blinked, guilt stirring beneath comprehension. "You didn't tell me." "There wasn't anything to tell. It was just work." She turned slightly, her face calm in the half-light. 2 weeks before that. We ran short on materials at the courthouse. Someone miscalculated the order. The supplier wouldn't deliver without payment up front. The crew needed their Friday hours to stay on payroll. He straightened. "I remember that shortage. We thought the vendor extended credit. They didn't," she said simply. "I paid it myself. $312.80. Not a fortune, but enough to keep things moving." He stared at her. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because it wasn't about money," she said. "It was about the men who would have lost a weekend's pay for a mistake they didn't make. Sometimes dignity costs less than attention." The wind lifted again, carrying the faint echo of the band inside. Graham felt his throat tighten, not from pride, but from something more painful, the sudden awareness of how much he'd taken for granted. Claire's eyes were still on the horizon, where the water blurred into sky. "And before you ask, yes," she added quietly. "I used to sing, professionally, small ensembles, mostly weddings, charity events, that kind of thing." He nodded, almost afraid to speak. "I stopped after my sister died," she continued. "We used to sing together. After the accident, I couldn't. Every note reminded me of what I'd lost. Then Ethan came to live with me, and music became something I didn't have time for. He needed stability, not lullabies." Her voice didn't tremble, but the steadiness itself was its own grief. "I'm sorry," Graham said. She turned to him then, eyes calm but bright. "Don't be. Everyone carries something. Mine just happens to hum when it's quiet." The river breeze stirred between them, cooling the warmth of the ballroom still clinging to their clothes. Graham swallowed. "All this time, you kept things running, the projects, the finances, the details, and I thought of you as someone dependable, efficient. but I never asked what that cost." She smiled faintly. "You didn't have to ask. You just had to look." He let the words settle, the weight of them pushing against the years he'd spent gliding through his own world without really seeing the people holding it together. For a long while, neither spoke. The city hummed beyond them, riverboats drifting slow under the bridge lights. Claire's locket caught the faint shimmer of gold, a tiny, quiet heartbeat of silver against her throat. "Finally," Graham said, "you asked me once what I build besides houses. I think I've spent my life restoring walls that didn't need it and ignoring the people who did." She looked at him fully now, and for the first time that night, his composure cracked not from shame, but from the sudden, simple act of honesty. "I didn't look," he said. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a confession meant for forgiveness. It was the first true thing he'd said all night. Claire nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Well," she said softly, "you're looking now." The orchestra shifted into a gentle ballad inside. Through the open doors, the murmur of laughter rose again. But out here, the air was clear, the night alive with the scent of magnolia and salt. Graham rested his hands on the railing, the light of the river painting his face in silver. "If I could start again," he murmured, "I'd do it differently." Claire's voice was quiet but certain. "Then start differently tomorrow." He turned to answer, but she was already walking toward the doorway, her figure framed by the glow of the chandeliers. He watched her go, not as an employer watching an employee, but as a man realizing that Grace had been standing beside him all along, waiting for him to notice. The music swelled softly, the river rolled on, and for the first time in a long while, Graham Whitaker stood still, humbled by what he finally saw. The night was winding toward its end, the kind of hour when glasses sat half empty and polite smiles grew thin. The MC, a well-meaning young man in a tuxedo that didn't quite fit, tapped the microphone, his voice wobbling over feedback. "Before we conclude tonight's festivities," he began, "we'd like to thank our sponsors, our donors, our wonderful guests." His cue card slipped from his hand, scattering across the stage like fallen leaves. Laughter rippled, polite but tired, and perhaps a final word from our board. No one moved. In the lull, a chair scraped softly against the marble floor. Mr. Avery stood again, his presence quiet but commanding. He didn't reach for the microphone. He simply raised a hand. The crowd hushed. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying easily even without amplification. "We've heard fine speeches tonight about rebuilding, about generosity, but there's something we haven't yet done." All eyes turned to him. He looked toward Claire, who had taken a seat near the edge of the room, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "We've thanked our patrons," Mr. Avery continued, "but not the caretakers, the ones who do the daily mending, who make things whole again." He took a breath. "There's a hymn I've carried in my mind since the hurricane years. I wonder, Miss Monroe, would you bless us with one song, just one, for them?" The room stilled. Even the waitstaff froze mid-step. Claire blinked, her pulse stuttering. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. Then she saw the faces curious, expectant, kind, and Lydia's, tight with disbelief. "That's not on the program," Lydia said sharply from the front table. "We have a schedule to maintain." Mr. Avery turned, his expression gentle but immovable. "Then consider it an unscheduled act of grace." A low murmur swept the crowd. The MC looked helplessly toward Graham. Graham's jaw flexed. He felt the weight of the room pressing on him, the cameras, the donors, the expectations. Yet over all that, he saw only her, Claire, sitting quietly beneath the glow of the chandeliers, the silver locket at her throat, catching the light like a pulse. "If Claire is willing," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Every sound seemed to retreat. Claire's fingers traced the edge of her napkin. For years, she had promised herself she'd never do this again, never open the part of her that still hurt to breathe through. But something in the way, Mr. Avery had asked no pressure. No pity unlocked a door she'd kept sealed too long. She closed her eyes. The room blurred into silence. Then she gave a small nod. Someone dimmed the lights without being told. The orchestra waited, hands hovering over instruments that wouldn't be needed. Claire stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of her midnight blue dress. She didn't walk toward the stage. Instead, she stepped a few paces into the open space at the center of the room, near the marble column where the chandelier's reflections trembled on the floor. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing. The hush deepened until even the river beyond the windows seemed to still. Then she began. No microphone, no accompaniment, only her voice bare, unguarded, true. It rose soft at first, like breath catching light, then deepened, carrying through the room in waves that brushed against stone and plaster. Every note seemed to find a place to rest on the glassware, on the shoulders of strangers, on the quiet ache people didn't talk about. It wasn't perfect. There was a rough edge where grief still lived, but that imperfection made it human, made it holy. Somewhere near the back, a woman lowered her phone, realizing she couldn't capture what was happening. Someone else dabbed at a tear without knowing why. The melody was familiar, though no one could name it. It had the cadence of old hymns and lullabies, something you might have heard once in a church basement or whispered to a child during a storm. When her voice reached the refrain, it filled every inch of the hall, not loud, but immense. Hold fast, all who labor. The dawn is not far. You mend what's broken. You know who you are. Her tone wavered, then steadied. The room, 100 strong, leaned in. Even Lydia, rigid in her seat, felt her breath slow without permission. Graham stood near the edge of the stage, his heart caught somewhere between awe and shame. He realized he had spent years working beside someone whose strength he'd mistaken for simplicity, whose silence he'd confused with smallness. When the final note came, it didn't so much end as dissolve like mist at sunrise. And for one long, suspended moment, no one moved. Then, quietly, people began to rise. Not in the clamor of applause, but in reverence. Chairs scraped, glasses stilled, conversations died. It was not a standing ovation. It was a kind of standing stillness, a recognition that they had been given something rare, not a performance, but shelter. Mr. Avery's head bowed slightly, eyes closed. The orchestra conductor placed his baton down on the music stand, hands trembling. Even the MC forgot to speak. Claire exhaled, barely audible. Her hands, which had trembled before, were steady now. Ben was the first to move. He raised his glass silently toward her. One by one, others followed. Not a toast this time, no jokes, no speeches, just a quiet chorus of lifted hands acknowledging something they couldn't quite name. Graham's throat tightened. For once, he didn't try to lead or frame or fix. He just stood there, watching her. The woman who had turned humiliation into harmony. When Claire finally sat back down, she didn't look around. She didn't need to. The air itself had changed the energy of the room, recalibrated to something gentler, truer. Lydia shifted in her chair, clapping once, awkwardly. The sound fell flat against the hush. Outside the tall windows, the Savannah River glowed in the moonlight, slow and patient. The reflection of the ballroom flickered on its surface like hundreds of small votive candles, drifting wherever the current carried them. Mr. Avery leaned toward her as the applause began at last, hesitant but growing. "Thank you," he whispered. Claire smiled faintly, her eyes bright but unweeping. "It wasn't for them," she said softly. "It was for her." He nodded, understanding. When the applause finally swelled, it wasn't for the assistant or the singer. It was for every unseen soul who had ever carried the weight quietly, one floorboard at a time. And as the sound filled the ballroom, Graham felt something inside him unclench. For the first time that night, he understood that dignity didn't demand attention. It simply waited to be recognized. The applause was still tapering off when the first murmur broke through it, a thin, nervous laugh from somewhere near the front. The kind of sound people make when they don't know what to do with awe. "Well," said a board member with a silver mustache and a glass of bourbon that had long since lost its ice. "At least, now we know where the assistant spent her bonus." A few others chuckled softly, trying to turn the emotion of the room back into something familiar, something safe. Graham froze. The words landed like grit on clean glass. Claire, who had been sitting again, lifted her head just slightly. Her face didn't change, but her shoulders drew a fraction tighter. Before Graham could speak, another voice cut across the room. "She didn't buy that dress," Ben said. Every head turned. He was standing near table 21, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his face flushed but determined. "We did." The silence that followed was thicker than any applause had been. Ben took a breath, his voice steadier now. "The crew chipped in last week. Every guy who worked those double shifts in December. Every woman who patched drywall while the heat was out." Someone muttered. "Why would you do that?" Ben looked around the room at the donors, the suits, the people who'd never touched a cold beam in their lives. Because last winter, when payroll was delayed for 2 weeks, Claire made sure we all got paid anyway. We didn't know how at the time, just that we didn't go home empty-handed for Christmas. A ripple passed through the crowd, confusion, shame, awe, disbelief. Claire's eyes dropped to the tablecloth. She wanted to tell him to stop, to spare her this spotlight that burned too bright. But Ben wasn't looking for permission. He was protecting something sacred. She said it was an accounting adjustment. He went on, but later, one of the bookkeepers told us she covered the shortfall herself, until the client's check cleared. He stopped then, not to dramatize, but to breathe. That dress. It's the least we could do. No one moved. Camera phones that had been raised slowly lowered again. Lydia's mouth parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Graham stood motionless, the sound of the river faint behind the glass. The truth rearranged itself in his chest, heavy and clear. Ben exhaled, his voice rough. Some of us don't have titles or foundations or trust funds, but when somebody holds the line for you, you remember. You pay it back however you can. He nodded toward Claire, who still hadn't spoken. We just wanted her to have one night where she didn't have to hold it all together. And then he sat down. It was the quietest moment of the evening. Lydia looked to Graham, her expression tight, brittle. "Are you just going to let this working-class storytelling take over your gala?" He turned to her. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "I think it already has." He moved toward the stage. The MC started to hand him the microphone, hesitated, then stepped aside. The sound system hummed faintly as Graham adjusted it. He looked out at the crowd, the investors, the city officials, the workers at the back, the people who'd all, in one way or another, benefited from silence. "When I sent that invitation to Claire," he began, "I told myself it was a gesture of fairness, an open invitation, nothing more, but it wasn't. It was a joke." The words fell heavy. "I invited her because I thought she wouldn't come," he continued, "because I didn't think she belonged in this room." Lydia shifted uncomfortably, but Graham didn't stop. "Tonight, I saw exactly who did belong. Not because of what she wore, not because she sang, but because for 3 years, she's been doing work that none of us bothered to notice." He scanned the room, meeting eyes that quickly dropped. When the Madison Square inspection was about to fail, she fixed it before sunrise. When a materials shortage threatened to shut down our courthouse project, she paid out of her own pocket to keep the crew working. And when my office was crumbling under its own pride, she kept it standing. Claire felt her chest tighten. He was saying things she had never expected to be said aloud. Graham's voice steadied. "So, tonight, instead of pretending this was all just good fun, I want to do something real. The firm will be funding that therapy keyboard from the auction, in full. And starting next month, we'll sponsor a yearly apprenticeship, 1 position every year for someone from the community who deserves a fair start in restoration. no matter their background. A murmur swept the room, surprise, approval, a few scattered claps that grew louder, then steadier. "This isn't charity," Graham said firmly. "It's correction." He glanced at Claire then, his tone softening. "Because the people who hold things together, while the rest of us get the credit, they're the ones who teach us what integrity actually looks like." Mr. Avery rose again, slow but deliberate. "I'll match the first year of funding," he said. Someone else called out, "Make it 2." And suddenly, what had begun as a gala of vanity became something else entirely a reckoning, gentle but unmistakable. Lydia sat rigid, her eyes darting toward the donors she'd courted all evening, now clapping without looking her way. Her smile returned, brittle as spun sugar. Graham lowered the microphone. The applause filled the hall sincere, thunderless, human. When it faded, he turned toward Claire. For a moment, neither spoke, but the look they shared carried more weight than words. She rose quietly, smoothing her dress. "Thank you," she said, not for the speech, but for finally seeing what had been there all along. He nodded once, humbled. The orchestra struck up a new melody, soft, slow, the kind of song meant to accompany a beginning rather than an ending. Ben leaned over to Claire as she passed. "Looks like you just got yourself a legacy," he said, grinning. Claire smiled faintly. "No," she murmured, eyes on the stage where Graham still stood. "We all did." She turned toward the windows again, the river lights rippling like applause too delicate to hear. The air inside the ballroom felt different now, lighter, truer, as though something sacred had been returned to its rightful place. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to imagine what could come next. Not rescue, not redemption, but something sturdier. Respect built plank by plank, steady as breath. The chandelier above them flickered once, catching her locket's glint a small echo of light, carried quietly into tomorrow. The ballroom behind them hummed with soft conversation and the scrape of chairs. Champagne still flowed, laughter still flickered, but under it all, a shift had settled in. Something had cracked and let in light. Graham slipped through a side door into the backstage corridor. The noise dimmed immediately, replaced by the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the faint echo of his own footsteps. The hall stretched long and narrow, lined with crates of floral arrangements and folded tablecloths. The smell of wax and roses clung to the air. He stopped halfway down, leaning against the wall, trying to steady the rush in his chest. For the first time all night, he could feel the pulse of consequence clean, inevitable. A door clicked behind him. He didn't turn. He already knew who it was. Lydia's heels struck the marble like punctuation. Her dress shimmered even in the dull backstage light, but the sheen of charm that usually wrapped her was gone. "So, that's it," she said, her voice controlled but brittle. "That was your grand act of chivalry." He straightened slowly. "If you mean telling the truth, then yes." She crossed her arms. "You humiliated me to lift her?" "No," he said quietly. "I humiliated myself. She didn't need me to lift her." She stood up alone. Lydia let out a sharp breath, half laugh, half disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself? You just dismantled your own reputation in front of half of Savannah's donors. For what? For her?" He looked at her then, steady, almost sad. "For what's right?" She shook her head. "You've lost your mind. All those years building this our firm, our standing, and you threw it away over some sentimental guilt. Maybe it needed throwing away," he said. "Maybe what we built was beautiful on paper and hollow underneath." Her jaw tightened. "Don't turn this into philosophy, Graham. You embarrass people tonight. You embarrass me." "I told the truth," he said again. "That's not embarrassment. That's repair." She took a step closer, her perfume sharp in the cold air. "You don't get to repair your conscience at my expense." Graham studied her, realizing how many times they'd stood like this before different rooms. Same silence beneath the surface. I didn't plan to hurt you, he said softly. Then why does it feel like you just walked out of our life? Because maybe I did. Lydia's voice rose, trembling now. You think she's better than me? No, he said, and it wasn't defensive. I think she's different. She's honest, even when it costs her comfort. And I'm trying to be that too. Her expression wavered between fury and disbelief. You're choosing her. He shook his head. I'm choosing a standard. That landed heavier than any argument. No more smallness. Lydia, he said quietly, no more pretending that kindness is weakness. No more treating decency like it's decoration for the speeches we give. I can't keep living that way. She blinked, stunned by the calm in his voice. For a long time, neither spoke. The hum of the lights filled the silence. Lydia's eyes softened, just for a breath. Do you know how many years I've stood beside you? How many rooms I made possible for you to walk into? I do, he said, and I'm grateful. But you built those rooms to be admired in. Lydia? She builds them to be useful. A flicker of hurt crossed her face, real, unguarded. You sound like you're done. He nodded once. I think I am. She exhaled, her composure fracturing only slightly. You'll regret this. All that virtue you're chasing, it doesn't survive in business. Or love. He managed a small, sad smile. Then maybe it's time to stop confusing business with love. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but instead, she straightened her shoulders, restoring the only armor she knew. Good luck being noble. Graham, she said, her tone cutting but tired. The city will eat you alive. He stepped aside, letting her pass. Then I'll build something it can't swallow. She paused by the exit door, her hand on the handle. You think people will applaud you for this. They'll forget her song by morning. He looked down the long corridor toward the faint sound of the orchestra tuning again. Maybe, but I won't. Lydia hesitated, then opened the door and walked out. Her heels echoed once, twice, then disappeared into the muffled hum of the ballroom. Graham stayed where he was, staring at the space she'd left behind. The air smelled faintly of candle smoke and magnolia from the arrangements. He let out a long breath. For the first time in years, he wasn't angry, just emptied, in a way that felt strangely clean. He thought of Claire, how she'd stood under the chandeliers and sung without fear, how she'd walked away from applause like it meant nothing. He thought of the crew, of Ben's blunt loyalty, of the way truth had looked tonight, ordinary, uncomfortable, unignorable. The firm would survive, or it wouldn't. The city would talk, or it wouldn't. But for the first time in a long time, Graham felt the quiet steadiness that comes after something breaks for good reason. He started walking back down the corridor, the soles of his shoes clicking softly against the marble. Ahead, through the half-open door, the sound of the river carried faintly inside, steady and patient, washing against the docks. He stopped once, looking over his shoulder at the darkened hallway behind him. There was no anger there, no regret, only the faint scent of roses, and the echo of a choice made not for love or image, but for the kind of peace that only truth allows. When he stepped back into the light, the music was swelling again, gentle and human. The kind of melody that sounded like forgiveness might be possible not someday, but soon. Monday morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of Savannah dawn that smelled faintly of rain and old brick. The city moved slower after the gala weekend, coffee shops quieter, buses half full, the river carrying last night's reflection downstream. At the office, the hum of printers and the rattle of delivery carts filled the air. Claire sat at her usual desk, same window, same wooden mug coaster, same paperclip jar, but something about the space felt subtly different. The air had cleared, the weight had shifted. Her mug, the one that said "measure twice," steamed beside her keyboard. She was reviewing payables, subcontractor invoices, insurance adjustments, one misfiled estimate from the Madison Square project that she corrected without thinking. Her hands moved with practiced steadiness, but her mind replayed flashes from the gala, the hush before her song, Ben's voice defending her, Graham's words into the microphone. She had tried to forget, but some truths stayed like gentle bruises, painful. Yes, but proof of healing. The office door opened. She didn't look up at first, assuming it was Carla with another delivery log. "Morning," came a familiar voice. Claire lifted her eyes. Graham stood there, holding 2 coffees, sleeves rolled up, no tie. His expression was cautious, as though the hallway had grown longer overnight. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting a cup beside her mug. "Thank you," she said quietly, not breaking eye contact. He waited a beat, then pulled a manila folder from under his arm. "I wanted to talk to you about a few changes. Official ones." Claire arched an eyebrow. "Official usually means paperwork." "It does," he said, almost smiling. "But good paperwork, for once." He placed the folder on her desk and slid it toward her. The label read, "Reorganization Proposal, Heritage Partnerships Program." She flipped it open. Inside were typed pages, clear, concise, signed by the board. At the top, Director of Heritage Partnerships, Claire Monroe. She blinked. "Director?" He nodded. "It's not a title for show. You'll manage all community restoration collaborations, historic sites, apprenticeships, outreach, real budget, full hiring authority." She kept her expression composed, though a flicker of surprise softened her voice. "And my current duties, delegated to Carla. She's ready." Claire glanced down the page again. The numbers weren't symbolic, they were substantial. A raise, yes, but more importantly, funding allocations she could direct without layers of approval. "You could have emailed this," she said finally. "I could have," he admitted. "But I wanted to look you in the eye when I said, this isn't penance, it's recognition." For a moment, the only sound was the whir of the copy machine down the hall. Claire leaned back, folding her arms gently. "You're sure the board approved this?" "They did," he said, after I reminded them that repair doesn't just apply to buildings. Her eyes lingered on the folder. The title looked unreal, printed on paper, too official, too heavy. "I'll accept," she said slowly. "On 3 conditions." He smiled, just barely. "Of course you will." She counted on her fingers. Calm and deliberate. 1 flexible hours. "My mother's physical therapy is midweek. I won't leave her waiting because a meeting ran long." "Understood," he said, without hesitation. 2 Ethan's summer camp tuition, he's been accepted to the youth tech program in Atlanta. I want that as a pre-tax set aside in my compensation plan. "Done," Graham replied. She studied him, testing for flinch, but found none. "And 3, she said finally. "The apprenticeship initiative, the one you announced Saturday, must include travel stipends. Some of the best applicants won't even apply if they can't afford the bus fare or lodging. If we're serious about equity, it starts there." He nodded slowly. "That's not a small request. It's not a small promise," she countered. Their eyes met steady, searching. Then Graham reached for the pen clipped inside the folder. He didn't rush. He turned to the last page, scrolled through the clauses once, and signed his name with deliberate care. "Done," he said, setting the pen down. Something unspoken passed between them. Not triumph, not gratitude, but trust. Quiet, durable, like the first line drawn on a blueprint after demolition. Claire closed the folder gently. "You understand this doesn't make us even?" "I'm not trying to make us even," he said. "I'm trying to make us right." A faint smile touched her lips. "That's harder, I know," he replied. "But I've started measuring twice. For the first time." She laughed, a soft sound, brief but real. They stood there for a moment in that small office, sunlight slipping through the blinds, striping the papers between them. Graham looked around at the simple desk, the worn chair, the wall calendar where she tracked every project deadline with color-coded ink. "You've kept this place running better than any system I've designed," he said. "I just didn't notice until it almost broke." Claire shook her head. "No, you noticed. You just didn't understand what you were seeing." He took a step back, accepting the truth of that. When he reached the door, she said quietly, Graham, he paused. You were right the other night, she said. Repair isn't pretty, but it holds, he gave a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than words. Then let's build something that holds. After he left, the office settled into its usual rhythm, the hum of fax machines, the scent of fresh coffee. Claire sat for a long moment, her hand resting lightly on the signed folder. She thought of her mother at the rehab center, Ethan's laughter in the evenings, the choir keyboard that had already been delivered to the community hall. One by one, the numbers on her spreadsheets began to look less like transactions and more like stories, small acts of balance between what was owed and what was restored. She opened a new ledger tab, labeled it simply Partnership Fund, and typed the first entry in neat script: travel stipend, apprentice pilot program, $3,000, authorized. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Then, almost unconsciously, she added a note in the margin: measure twice, trust once. She smiled faintly, closed the file, and reached for her mug. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight spread across the river like a clean sheet of copper. And inside her small office, the sound of renewal was quieter than applause, just the steady, certain rhythm of someone finally being seen, doing what she'd always done, making things right. The city began to change in ways so quiet that no one could trace when it started. It wasn't in the newspapers, though they tried headlines about new apprenticeship initiative and local firm sponsors music outreach. But the truth of it lived elsewhere in the hammer's rhythm, in the hum of voices, in the soft ways people began to listen again. A boy of 16 stood on a front porch in the heat of June, a carpenter's pencil tucked behind his ear. He squinted down at the measuring tape stretched across a tread, 36 inches wide, exactly as the drawing said. He grinned, proud of the precision. Measure twice, Ben said from behind him, hands resting on his hips. Cut once. The boy repeated it softly, like a line from a hymn. He marked the line again, the sawdust rising like pollen in the morning light. Across the street, Claire watched from the sidewalk, a clipboard in her hand. The porch belonged to the Sanders family storm damage from last fall. It wasn't much, but when the boy's saw blade found its rhythm, neighbors began to gather on the curb. The sound of building was the sound of belonging. By afternoon, Claire's phone buzzed with updates from 3 other crews' new trainees, local sites. She replied with quiet encouragements, her handwriting small, looping, confident. That evening, after work, she drove to St. Bart's, the same church where her song had once echoed through the candlelight. The roof was still tarped, patched but waiting for the final repair. Inside, the air smelled faintly of plaster and rain. 15 people had gathered there, carpenters, bookkeepers, 2 retirees from the city choir, and a handful of apprentices who didn't yet know what harmony meant. Claire stood at the front with her hands clasped. Just 20 minutes, she said gently. You don't have to sound perfect. You just have to sound together. They began hesitantly, voices thin and unpracticed, like a ladder missing rungs. But with each line, something loosened. Claire's voice threaded through theirs, not commanding, just steady. The sound of someone who had learned to lead by listening. The song filled the small space, curling up toward the rafters. Rain tapped softly on the tarp above, keeping time. Graham stood at the back, unnoticed, his arms folded loosely. He didn't sing, he didn't need to. He just listened the way builders listen to the grain of wood before the first cut, the way someone changed learns to be quiet. Afterward, Ben appeared in the doorway, sawdust still in his hair. You'll have a choir by Christmas, he said with a grin. Claire laughed. Only if you promise to sing bass. I'll consider it, he said, though everyone knew he couldn't carry a tune. The next week, the apprentices program opened its first official class. 6 teens from different neighborhoods, 2 veterans retraining for civilian work, and 1 retired teacher who said she just wanted to learn how to fix something again. Ben taught joinery patient, methodical. Graham walked the site, speaking less, watching more. Sometimes he'd kneel beside a student measuring joists and say nothing, just nod when the line was straight. At lunch, he'd sit on the steps, eating out of a brown paper bag like the others, and talk about foundations not as metaphors, but as math. Claire managed the logistics from her small office, but she made time to visit every site at least once a week. She carried clipboards, thermoses, and a quiet authority that made even the roughest foreman lower his voice when she spoke. Sometimes she stayed long after sunset, sketching notes in the dimming light, the world settling into its evening hum. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't even remarkable, not in the way that made headlines stick, but it was honest, and that made it enough. One Friday evening, she picked up Ethan from his robotics club. He chattered the whole drive about gears, sensors, the science fair in August. She smiled, listening, half the time not even to the words, but to the joy in his voice. When they reached home, the windows glowed soft gold from the lamps she'd left on for her mother. June sat in her chair, knitting a scarf from leftover yarn, humming a tune that Claire realized was one of hers. "You've been out late, sweetheart," June said. "Just checking a site," Claire replied, kissing her cheek. "It's almost finished. Porch rails go up tomorrow." June smiled, her eyes warm. "That sounds like music." Later, after dinner, Ethan curled beside her on the couch, the hum of the ceiling fan above them. She'd been sorting receipts, half listening as he told her about school. Then, after a pause, he asked quietly, "Mom?" "Yes." "Baby, I like when you sing." She looked down, startled by the softness of his tone. "You do." He nodded, small hand resting on hers. "It makes the air feel safe." Her throat tightened. She squeezed his hand gently. "Me too," she whispered. Outside, the night was thick with summer sounds, crickets, the low rustle of magnolia leaves, the far-off hum of riverboats drifting past the old warehouses. Somewhere across town, in the echo of a half-repaired church, the choir practiced again, their voices lifting into the dark like lanterns. And though the city didn't pause to notice, it heard. In the scrape of sandpaper, in the hum of a saw, in the harmony of 15 people learning to sing together, it heard what had been rebuilt, not grandeur, not spectacle, just care, steady and measured. And if anyone listening had looked up at the right moment, they might have seen it, the faint reflection of those voices carried over the water, weaving with the sound of hammers, soft but certain, like the heartbeat of a place learning to heal. The light was soft that evening, the kind Savannah keeps for itself, honey gold fading to lavender, the kind that makes the old brick shimmer as if it remembers everything. Claire sat on a wooden bench along River Street, paper cup of pecan ice cream melting slowly in her hand. Beside her, Ethan was already halfway through his own, chin streaked with vanilla. Her mother, June, sipped hers carefully, every motion deliberate, her scarf tucked against the breeze. The river moved with its unhurried grace, carrying the glow of the sinking sun under the bridge and out toward the sea. Cargo ships drifted past, massive and slow, their horns sounding like low, ancient prayers. For the first time in months, maybe years, Claire wasn't rushing anywhere. The ledger was balanced, the phone silent, the world for once not asking her to prove anything. Ethan pointed suddenly. "That one's from Panama, right?" She smiled. "You've been paying attention." He grinned, proud of his geography, then leaned against her arm. June chuckled softly, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "You used to point at every ship like that," she told Claire. "You thought they all carried stars." "I suppose they still do," Claire said, looking out at the horizon. A few minutes passed in easy quiet. Street musicians began to tune up behind them, an old man with a banjo, a woman tapping a tambourine. Somewhere farther down, tourists laughed near the fudge shop. The air smelled of sugar and salt. Then, from behind, the faint sound of footsteps on the cobblestone measured familiar. Graham appeared, a little breathless, toolbox in hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, hair damp from sweat, a smudge of sawdust still on his forearm. "Sorry I'm late," he said, Neighbor's stare gave out. Took longer than I thought. Claire turned toward him. Not surprised. You can't walk past a loose hinge without fixing it? Can you? Old habits, he said, smiling. At least now they serve the right purpose. He set the toolbox down by the bench. Ethan scooted over to make room, Pecan Graham asked, nodding at the paper cups. Only the best, June said, offering him a spare spoon from her purse. You missed the first round? I'm a patient man, he said, sitting down, or learning to be. The river wind tugged at his shirt. For a while, they just sat four silhouettes framed by the last of the day. No speeches, no apologies, just the simple comfort of people who had already said what mattered. Ethan licked the last of his ice cream and leaned forward. Look, Mom, he's waving. A sailor high on the deck of a passing cargo ship lifted his arm in a slow, cheerful salute. Claire waved back, laughing softly. The sound carried easily on the water. Graham watched her laugh unposed, unguarded, and felt the strange stillness of gratitude. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was something gentler, the recognition that in a world full of noise, someone else had chosen the same quiet. He looked down at his hands. For once, they were clean, no splinters, no ink stains, no pretense, just hands that worked, then rested. June leaned back on the bench, eyes half closed. It's good to see people together without needing to be anywhere else, she murmured. Claire smiled. That's the goal, isn't it? To stop running? Graham nodded. To stop fixing what isn't broken. A small pause. Or, Claire said softly, to fix the right things for once. The street lamps began to flicker on, one by one. The first stars appeared above the bridge, faint but steady. Ethan pressed close to his mother's side, watching the ripples stretch into twilight. Claire hummed, barely above the sound of the river, a few bars of the song she had sung that night at the gala. The same melody, but quieter now, shaped not for an audience but for the air itself. The notes drifted across the water, caught in the low hum of engines and the rustle of evening leaves. Graham listened, head bowed slightly, as though not to disturb the sound. It wasn't a performance this time. It was a remembering. He felt something open in his chest, not dramatic, not painful, just real, like the last click of a latch long stuck. June's hand found Claire's. Ethan's small fingers wrapped around both. The song faded into the night, leaving the hush that follows truth. No grand ending, no applause, just the river keeping the tune, carrying it forward steady, eternal, forgiving. A tugboat's horn sounded far off, deep and slow. Graham stood to pick up his toolbox, then hesitated. I can walk you home, he said quietly. Claire looked up at him, the light of the street lamp catching her eyes. We're not far, she said, but you can walk with us. He nodded once. They rose together, falling into an easy rhythm, the soft scrape of shoes on cobblestone, the boys' chatter weaving between them. The air was thick with night jasmine and the promise of cooler weather. At the corner, they paused to watch the river one last time. The water caught the city's reflection. Streetlights, windows, fragments of a life remade. Graham glanced sideways, saw Claire's profile against the glow. She wasn't transformed anymore. She was simply herself, strong, ordinary, luminous. And for the first time, he understood that the miracle hadn't been her arrival at that gala, or even her song. It was this her quiet presence, her unshakable grace, the way she turned survival into something that looked a lot like peace. They stood for another moment, saying nothing. Then Claire took Ethan's hand, her mother's arm, and started up the hill. Graham followed a step behind, toolbox in hand, a man who had learned to listen to others, to himself, to the slow music of redemption. The river moved beside them, silver under the bridge, keeping every sound that had ever mattered. And when the last note of Claire's humming faded into the dusk, it left behind only one truth soft, undeniable, echoing like the tide. Sometimes the smallest repair is the one inside your chest. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, not in grand gestures or perfect apologies, but in the quiet work of seeing each other clearly for the first time. Claire's story isn't about a miracle. It's about the slow courage of showing up as yourself when the world has already decided who you are. It's about the steady kindness that builds bridges where pride once stood, and the quiet forgiveness that doesn't erase the past, but makes peace with it. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove our worth, forgetting that dignity was never something we had to earn. It was ours all along, waiting for us to stop hiding behind what others expected and simply begin to live honestly. And maybe that's what redemption really is, not a second chance, but a clearer one. A moment when we choose to build, not bigger walls, but stronger tables. So, if you've ever felt unseen, remember this. The smallest repair, the one inside your chest, can still change everything around you. And sometimes, that's where love, respect, and peace finally begin to grow. Thank you for being here with us. For every minute you stayed, for every breath you took alongside these characters, you helped keep their story alive. At Shining Stories, we believe that the smallest acts of kindness, the quiet ones, the patient ones, can still change the way we see one another. Every story we tell is a reminder that compassion is never wasted, and that dignity is something we all share. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Each click helps us bring more real, human stories into the world, stories that heal, connect, and remind us that we're never truly alone. From all of us, thank you for listening.